Why would you save dollars when inflation's running at about 16%? They reported it at 8, but it's really at 16%. So you're going negative 16 on your money? Why would you save dollars? But these idiots, oh, you got to save money, get out of debt. I'm going, wait a minute. The dollar is created via debt. Don't you get that? And the only way they pay it back is via your taxes. Idiot, can't you get that? What happened in 1974 was ERISA was passed. ERISA's Income Retirement Security Exchange, something like 401k IRAs. Also in 1974, the gold became legal for Americans to own. So 74 was a very big year. So I had all this gold I was smuggling in from Hong Kong. I could now own it legally. And then, exactly as I said, Kissinger promises the Saudis will protect you as long as everybody in the world must buy oil in dollars. So it became the petrodollar, no longer a gold-backed dollar.
The dollar was backed by gold as far as governments were concerned. We promise that any of the gold that we're holding for you, you can exchange your dollars, or even just the dollars that you own. You can exchange them for gold at a fixed rate of $35 whenever you want. President de Gaulle from France realized that we were issuing more dollars in treasuries to fund war than we had gold backing these promises. So he sent warships filled with dollars to New York Harbor and said to, President Nixon, we want our gold back for these dollars. And we gave it to him, and he bled down a very large portion of the gold held at the U.S. Treasury. And at that moment, Nixon said, okay, August of 1971, that's it. Windows closed temporarily, although it's never opened back up, so it's been a long temporary. But we went back on our promise to the world. And it was at that moment that the dollar was backed by nothing. And so the question that I ask the people out there, and it's amazing how few people know the answer to this question, is what has made the dollar the world reserve currency ever since? And you get a myriad of answers, usually centered around our military, or we have the biggest and most robust economy, or whatever. And I guess you could argue some of that is true. But what has made the dollar the world reserve currency was that 3 years later, Henry Kissinger was dispatched to Saudi Arabia. And he made a promise to the Saudis. He said, how about this? We will back you. Well, let's call it a joint military cooperation agreement. And we will stand behind you. We'll provide you munitions and support. No one will ever mess with the Saudi kingdom. But for that, OPEC is going to value dollar or oil in dollars globally. Okay, they said, fine. And so since 1974, every single country on the planet has had to own, virtually every country has had to own dollars in order to buy oil. And it has created this synthetic demand for the dollar called the petrodollar and made the dollar the world reserve currency. If you want to power your country, you must own dollars. It is the protection of the Saudi kingdom, and by default, the relationship with OPEC that has enabled the dollar to be the world reserve since 1974, because 3 years prior, the link to gold was severed. The dollar was at that point fiat, backed by nothing. And obviously we all know the history. Since that point, the dollar's lost over 90% of its value, but that's for a discussion for a different day. Our Fed Chairman Powell, I believe, has no intention of being written about in history books as blowing up the American dream. Because in the last 3 years, more money has been created in the last 3 years than in the entire history of the country before. The majority of that money that has been created, or a good portion of it, went into assets, where hedge funds can borrow $1 billion at 1%, plow it into equities, plow it into real estate, plow it into cryptocurrencies, make a fortune, pay off the loan with no problem at all, make huge bonuses. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is a massive distortion in asset prices. You could call this the crack-up boom in Austrian economics, where massive expansion in credit and lowered interest rates create distortions and misallocations of capital and resources, where price discovery is next to impossible. Houses are doubling or tripling in a year. Equity portfolios the same. Cryptocurrencies up 10 times. You've been in finance longer than I have, and you know that's not how markets work. They don't go parabolic like this. And I think a lot of it has to do with the distortions and the misallocations that were created through massive money printing. So I think Fed Chairman Powell has no intention of blowing up the system and getting tough on inflation. The National Bureau of Economic Research came out with a report not too long ago and said that the 9.1% inflation that was listed in July of this year would have been 16.5% if calculated it the way that they used to in 1980. Like you said, John Williams of Shadow Stats, a legend in this industry, all he does is show the numbers the way that the Fed and the Bureau of Labor Statistics used to calculate numbers. But even if we believe the 9%, by the way, that CPI excludes food, energy, and housing, right? So they pulled out the things that we need that are inflating to give us this now 8.5%. So he says he's getting tough on inflation and raising it to 2.25%, maybe to 3.25% at the next meeting. What good does that do against 8.5% inflation, which we know is probably closer to 17%? What getting tough on inflation is what Paul Volcker did under the same situation, only when they calculated inflation truthfully.
Right.
Inflation at 16 or 17%, what did he do? He raised the federal funds rate to 19.75%, blew up the economy and blew up inflation. Powell, on the other hand, getting tough on inflation, he's pussyfooting. He raised it to 2.25% with 9% inflation. That's a negative 7% plus real return, negative. That's not getting tough on inflation. And what is so unusual about the environment we find ourselves in? Stocks, bonds, and real estate at all-time highs are what? Inversely correlated to a rise in interest rates.
Right.
So if he raises rates, he knows it's a religious experience in this country for everyone who considers themselves wealthy in traditional assets. This is why they're pussyfooting and raising the rates just little by little. This is why the quantitative tightening that they were talking about hasn't happened. They were going to do $80 billion a month in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. I think to date, over the last 4 months, they've only done 50, 60 billion off their balance sheet. They're not selling off their balance sheet, and they are in fact not raising rates, getting tough on inflation. They're not, right? Because he doesn't want to be written about in books. So I ask you, as I go on to mile marker number 4, were the consequences of this action intended or not? And I want you to think of what Klaus Schwab said in 2019, that there'll be a great reset, that you'll own nothing, and you'll be happy to rent. Now, when he said that, I thought he was an idiot. But when we get to the end of what I'm talking about here in 2022, we're going to reflect upon that. And so I don't think that he's going to do it. He's not going to get tough on inflation, but how about we create a villain? Because, our president is already telling us that inflation has nothing to do with historic money creation and everything to do with Putin, right? Well, inflation is always 100% of the time a monetary event, always. And when you throw in unproductivity in the equation, it exacerbates the effects of inflation. And that sounds like the last 3 years. Massive money creation, paying everyone to sit on their couch, play video games, and eat bonbons. So you have more money chasing less stuff because no one's producing anything. They're sitting on their couch. So that's the cause of inflation. It has nothing to do with Putin. It has everything to do with the Federal Reserve that has blown up, and a government that has blown up our money supply and incentivized people to be unproductive. There's your inflation. But what about the big picture? What about this reset? What about getting tough? Well, if the Fed doesn't want to be the reason for blowing everything up and creating the greatest depression of all time, how about we create a villain? And, I think that the people who are running the ship, they may be nefarious, but they're not stupid. They may be immoral, but they're not idiotic. And if you push the Russians out of SWIFT, if you sanction them, if you freeze their assets here in the States, you have every other country in this group, the BRICS, saying, are we next? Is it coming for us next? You think there's any coincidence that China has sold well over 100 billion in treasuries over the last 7 months? They have their eyes set on Taiwan. I think we pushed the Russians right into the open arms of the Chinese and their CIPS system, the cross interbank payment system. That is what the SWIFT is. It mirrors the SWIFT. It is their answer to the SWIFT. We pushed them right into the open arms of this coalesced group. So let's talk about what has happened and think about this. Did they absolutely have no idea that by freezing these assets and sanctioning them, that it wouldn't have severe consequences? I say to people all the time, imagine that the United States is Russia and that Mexico is the Ukraine, and we're in a war with the Ukraine, and Russia freezes us out of SWIFT, sanctions us, takes all of our assets, gives $90 billion to Mexico, provides them with Stinger missiles and drones and the intelligence of where to drop the bombs. Is that not a declaration of war? Sure as hell seems like it to me. But if you don't think that this is going to have profound impact globally, then you're a flippin' moron. And I want to say, in the back of my mind, I can't help but shake that this was an intended exercise on creating a villain and maybe getting this great reset that we're talking about. So let me just take it a little further. So far in 2022, and by the way, those sanctions which have done absolutely nothing, keep in mind that 85% of global population, including China, India, Africa, and South America, are still trading with Russia, right? So those sanctions didn't do anything. In fact, all it did was coalesce this mantra of Western hypocrisy and dominance needs to come to an end. Now, I'm not saying that this is my feeling, but I can see pretty easily why they would feel that way. So let's look and see what's happened as the toilet paper roll is spinning now. What's happened so far in 2022? It'll blow you away. First of all, as I mentioned, Nigeria and Saudi Arabia are selling their oil to China for the yuan-denominated petro-yuan bond, which is immediately convertible into gold. Shanghai Gold Exchange. You have the Russian-Iran-India corridor that just came out. This is linking Northwest Russia to the Persian Gulf via the Caspian Sea and Iran. Everyone else has to go all the way around, but the countries who are in the group get to cut through, right? You have Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia announce that they are contemplating joining the BRICS nations. Now, if you say publicly you're contemplating, it's a done deal. These countries are moving away from the Western alliances and they are joining the BRICS. And Saudi Arabia, did I mention Saudi Arabia? Yes, Saudi Arabia is joining the BRICS nations. You had Turkey come out and say they want to ditch the dollar for payments in Russian energy. And they've purchased 75 tons more gold in the first 7 months of the year than any central bank on the planet. They are the largest accumulators of gold. Turkey, who just said they're going to join the BRICS nations and wants to ditch the dollar for Russian energy, they are leading the way in 2022 on gold purchases. You have now 147 countries on the Belt Road, including all of the 13 OPEC countries. All of them are on the Belt Road Initiative. 6 of the 13 BRICS nations, or 6 of the 13 OPEC countries have already joined BRICS or are in process of joining. The 7th, United Arab Emirates, just joined the BRICS Bank. And now you have Russia and China standing arm in arm on a stage a month ago saying they are announcing a new world reserve currency. At the same time, you have gold leaving the COMEX market at the fastest monthly rate ever. You have silver, on the other hand, being massively drawn down through the London Metals Exchange to the smallest amount ever in recorded, ever since they had started keeping track of the amount of silver on the LME. And you have over 100 million ounces of silver taken out of SLV by the authorized participants. So you see massive accumulation of gold and silver off the exchanges taking possession. So let's put all of this together, right? So what does it all mean when put together? And let's think about the Great Reset. How do you get a Great Reset? Well, first, you blow up asset prices to all-time highs. And then at the lowest interest rates in human history. And then you incentivize the world to find a back door because you watch what just happened to the Russians, who 85% of the world is saying, well, you're still okay to trade with because they don't like the way the West has handled things. So they're all coalescing in this nation, 147 countries on the Belt Road. All of these countries in the BRICS nations, which amount to 90% of human population, all of this together. And think of the fallacy of composition. All of these countries, one by one, can't stand up to the U.S. You put them all together and they will dominate the U.S. So how does it all blow up? Why do you own gold and silver? Why? Remember, gold was classified the only tier 1 asset in the world next to U.S. dollars. Remember, the biggest money in the world, the central banks, the commercial banks, the sovereign wealth funds, the family offices, they're all buying it. They're all taking it off the exchanges, removing counterparty risk. You can see the drawdown from all of the major exchanges. How does this all blow up? Simple. Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS nations. Every OPEC producing country, all 13 of them are on the Belt Road. They all sit on a stage with their arms around each other on a Sunday night here in the States, Monday morning, somewhere in China or in Russia or wherever this meeting is. And Saudi Arabia says, hey, US, thank you. It's been a hell of a ride. We appreciate it. As you know, we are being now protected by China and Russia. In fact, we struck a joint military cooperation agreement the day you idiots pulled out of Afghanistan the way you did. And we realized that maybe you weren't the best partners to tie our wagon to. You know, you sent over President Biden to beg for oil. He didn't beg for oil. He hasn't even gone to Mexico or the Texas-Mexico border. He came and asked us to not join the BRICS nations. But we've decided after contemplation that, hey, you know what? It's in our best interest, and all of OPEC, who is on the Belt Road, that we're going to open up energy purchases in other currencies, including the yuan, the rupee, the ruble, maybe euro, gold, and dollars. Like that, it's over. Because what happens? Every country on the planet who has had to own dollars since 1974 dumps them. And if you ever saw the moving Trading Places, where one Duke brother says to the other Duke brother, sell, Mortimer, sell, because everyone will start dumping dollars. As the dollar collapses, that's pillar number one. The dollar value collapses. What happens when those dollars collapse and hit the U.S. shores? Hyperinflation. What happens as an adverse reaction of hyperinflation? Interest rates spike. You have to have higher interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. There's your villain. There is now, was it intended? Did they know this would happen? When everyone dumps dollars and Saudi Arabia and OPEC say, thanks for the memories, folks, and everyone dumps dollars and interest rates spike, stocks, bonds, real estate at the same time collapse along with the dollar. The four pillars of wealth in this country, stocks, bonds, dollars, and real estate, will all collapse as interest rates spike and as the dollar is globally dumped. And this is your great reset. This is how fragile the system truly is. And this is why you own precious metals. It is not to get rich, it's because we are on the cusp, I believe, of a change. Now, one last piece that I'd like to add to it. Remember we talked about 75% of human population understanding on the Belt Road this new digital yuan? Well, what is the digital yuan? To me, it is a beta test. Just the other day, and I'm almost done here, just the other day there was an article that came out by a man named Sergei Glazyev, and he is the Russian minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics for the Eurasian Economic Union. And he came out and he laid the fundamental principles by which the new U.S. post-dollar economic system will be based. And he goes on and says, and I quote, that it will not be based upon any particular currency as with the Bretton Woods order, but rather a market basket of local currencies tied more deeply to an array of real commodities such as gold, other precious metals, grain, hydrocarbons, sugar, etc. So think about the Chinese digital yuan. What better way to roll out a distributed ledger technology where you can show the world the veracity of everything that all of these countries have pegged? Why does the European Union not work? In theory, because there's nothing pegged to it, and each country is moving in different directions. But how about all of these countries coalescing not only against the maybe hatred's a strong word, but the universal dislike of the Western hegemony, so much so that we're seeing relationships being mended between Iraq and Iran, where they're building a railway, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, they're mending fences, between countries who have hated each other for years. But you know the old statement, my enemy's enemy is my friend? They're all coalescing against a central theme, but that's not enough. We need to peg something. What are all the countries that own all the commodities? The BRICS, and all of the countries that are joining the BRICS own all the commodities. So what better way to roll out distributed ledger technology but to show the pegging of all of the commodities pledged to the new BRICS currency, which they just announced is coming out? Why is gold tier one? You tell me. Did they know that this was going to happen? The inevitability and the mathematics of the dollar's demise? Is it going to be the central peg to a new world reserve currency? What better way to show the immutability and the veracity of this pegging but on a distributed ledger Chinese digital yuan, which I believe will be the rails to a new system, the rails to the new BRICS system, to the next BRICS currency.